There is something about the dark that makes the unknown feel closer. Not threatening, not urgent, just close, like a whisper carried through a very long hallway. You hear it, but you cannot quite make out the words. And somewhere in that space between knowing and not knowing, between the world that science has mapped and the edges it still cannot fully explain, there are places that have existed for centuries, for millennia, holding on to their secrets with extraordinary patience. Places where the ground does things it shouldn't, where the sky behaves in ways that contradict logic, where ancient stone sits in arrangements that should have been impossible given the tools available at the time they were built. And yet there they are, still standing, still silent, still waiting for someone patient enough to simply sit with them and stop demanding an explanation. Tonight, we are going to visit some of those places together, not with urgency, not with alarm, but slowly, carefully, the way you would walk through a fog-covered field at dusk, one careful step at a time, breathing softly, letting the strangeness settle around you without trying too hard to make it make sense. Because some of the world's most beautiful things are the ones that resist easy explanation, and in the quiet of the night, that resistance feels less like a puzzle to be solved and more like an invitation to simply rest in the not knowing, to let mystery be its own kind of comfort, to sit with questions that have no definitive answers yet, and discover that the questions themselves are generous, spacious, and surprisingly restful things to carry into sleep. These places exist on the same planet where you are resting tonight. They are not separated from you by imagination or fiction. They are real ground, real rock, real water, real fire. Some of them have been studied by scientists for centuries. Some of them are visited by thousands of tourists each year. Some of them have been photographed from space and analyzed by instruments of extraordinary precision. And yet, in each one, something remains that defies the categories we reach for most readily. Something that persists at the edge of what we can explain, that breathes in the space where our explanations run out. That something is worth sitting with tonight, quietly, without demand, in the comfortable dark. So find yourself a comfortable position now. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your jaw relax. Let your hands rest softly against whatever surface they are resting on. Feel the weight of your body becoming heavier, more settled, more at ease with each slow breath. Let your breath slow until it finds its own natural rhythm. In and out, easy and unhurried, like the tide moving against a quiet shore somewhere peaceful and far away. And then, gently, let's begin our journey into the most mysterious places on Earth. Before we go any further, I just want to take a very small moment to say something from the heart. If this kind of slow, calm, historical storytelling helps you drift off at night, it would mean a great deal to me if you would hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. My name is Heyo, and this is Boring History for Sleep, a channel dedicated to bringing you long, peaceful stories from the past and the wide world around us. Stories designed to ease your mind and carry you gently toward sleep. Right now, I am working toward my first 1,000 subscribers, and honestly, every single one of them matters more than you might imagine. If tonight's journey brings you some rest, please leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is on your clock. And if you have a little sleepy hype left in you before the night takes you, please send it our way. It means more than you know. Now, let's continue. The Bermuda Triangle. The ocean that swallows. Somewhere between the coast of Miami, the island of Bermuda, and the northern edge of Puerto Rico, there is a stretch of water that has accumulated more legend, more lore, and more nervous human energy than perhaps any other patch of ocean on the planet. It does not look different from the air. It does not glow on radar. There is no sign visible from a ship's deck, no change in the color of the water, no shift in the smell of the sea air that would tell you that you have crossed into it. And yet, for generations, the name alone has been enough to make sailors hesitate, to make pilots double-check their instruments, to make passengers on ocean liners lean against the railing and stare at the Atlantic with a particular alertness that the open sea does not ordinarily produce. This is the Bermuda Triangle, and whether you believe in its power or not, its story is one of the most fascinating and deeply strange chapters in the long history of humanity's relationship with the sea. The region covers approximately 500,000 square miles, an enormous expanse, larger than many countries, larger than most people imagine when they first hear the name. Within that space, the Atlantic Ocean runs deep and cold, with underwater geological features that make it one of the more complex regions in the Western Hemisphere. The Gulf Stream passes through it, carrying warm water from the Gulf of Mexico northward with a force and volume that can dwarf even the mightiest rivers on land. The Gulf Stream is so powerful that it can move floating debris at several miles per hour, meaning that wreckage from a ship that sinks within its current can be carried hundreds of miles from the site of the disaster within just a few days. Evidence disappears, trails go cold, the ocean closes over events with a finality that leaves investigators very little to work with. Weather in this part of the Atlantic can change with alarming speed. Clear skies can give way to violent squalls in the space of an hour. Waterspouts, tornadoes that form over the sea, are not uncommon here. And the ocean floor contains the Puerto Rico Trench, which at nearly 28,000 feet below sea level is the deepest point in the entire Atlantic Ocean. All of this matters, but none of it fully explains why the Bermuda Triangle has lodged itself so deeply in the human imagination, or why the stories that have accumulated around it feel so persistent, so stubborn, so impossible to fully shake loose. The legend began to take real shape in December of 1945, when 5 United States Navy torpedo bombers departed from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on a routine training exercise. The flight was called Flight 19. It consisted of 14 men, led by Lieutenant Charles Taylor. The weather was reasonable, the mission was straightforward, a triangular navigation exercise over the ocean, the kind of thing the squadron had done many times before. But something went wrong somewhere over the water that afternoon. Radio communications became erratic. Taylor reported that his compasses were behaving strangely, that he was unsure of his position, that he believed they were flying over the Gulf of Mexico rather than the Atlantic. His transmissions grew fainter as the afternoon wore on towards evening. The planes consumed their fuel, and then they were simply gone. All 14 men were lost. A search and rescue aircraft sent to find them also disappeared, along with its crew of 13. In total, 27 people vanished, and almost nothing was ever recovered. No aircraft wreckage, no bodies, no definitive answers. The official investigation concluded that the most probable cause was pilot disorientation, the dangerous confusion that arises when a pilot loses reliable spatial reference, compounded by deteriorating weather, exhausted fuel, and the unforgiving nature of flying over open water at night with no visual landmarks. But the story had already taken on a life of its own, drawing in earlier accounts of ships gone silent, boats found drifting crewless, aircraft that had dropped off radar without sending any distress call. By the time journalist Vincent Gaddis coined the term Bermuda Triangle in a 1964 magazine article, the mythology was well established and growing. When author Charles Berlitz published his enormously popular book on the subject in 1974, the legend became global, reaching readers in dozens of languages and selling in the tens of millions of copies. The theories that followed were extraordinary in their range and ambition, that ships and aircraft were not merely being lost to weather and human error, but were being taken, swallowed by something that ordinary science could not account for. Some theories pointed to supernatural forces, vortexes of energy, rifts in time and space, or the lost city of Atlantis buried beneath the ocean floor, its ancient machinery still actively pulling vessels down. Others favored extraterrestrial explanations. Still others proposed geological mechanisms, massive eruptions of methane gas from seafloor deposits, destabilizing ships before any distress call could be made. The reality is rather different from the legend. Lloyd's of London, whose entire business depends on accurately assessing maritime risk, does not charge higher premiums for vessels crossing the Bermuda Triangle. The United States Coast Guard has explicitly stated that the number of disappearances in the region is not significantly greater than in any comparable area of well-traveled ocean. Researcher Lawrence David Cush spent years investigating every documented case and found that many had been exaggerated, misreported, or had occurred entirely outside the triangle's boundaries. Some ships said to have vanished without explanation had sunk in documented storms. Some had disappeared elsewhere and been attributed to the triangle through creative geography. And yet, the story persists, because there is something about the ocean, about its depth, its darkness, its absolute and indifferent capacity for silence, that makes the idea of vanishing feel entirely plausible. The sea does not give back what it takes. Wrecks lie in darkness that human eyes may never reach. The water closes over everything, dissolving, dispersing, erasing. In that closing, in that absolute finality, mystery is born and nurtured and kept alive long after the physical evidence has been carried away by the current. There are aspects of the Bermuda Triangle that researchers acknowledge as genuinely unusual, even if not supernatural. The agonic line, where magnetic north and true north align precisely, passes through this region, which could cause subtle compass errors compounding over long distances. The Gulf Stream can scatter debris within hours of a sinking. The weather is genuinely unpredictable in ways that surprise experienced mariners. The depth of the Puerto Rico Trench makes recovery operations extraordinarily difficult. None of this requires the supernatural to explain, but all of it creates conditions in which accidents can happen without leaving the kinds of evidence that investigators need. So what do we do with the Bermuda Triangle? Perhaps we hold it lightly, without too much grip, without demanding it resolve into a tidy answer. The ocean is vast and old and deeply indifferent to our need for resolution. It has kept its secrets before, it will keep them again. And on a quiet night, with the dark water stretching to every horizon and the sky enormous and full of stars, the idea that some things simply remain unknown doesn't feel frightening at all. It feels, in its own strange way, like a kind of peace. Stonehenge, stones that refuse to explain themselves. There is a plain in the English county of Wiltshire, wide, grassy, gently rolling, the kind of landscape that in England almost always comes with a grey sky and the smell of rain either just fallen or about to fall. Sheep graze in the surrounding fields, chalk lies beneath the thin soil, and in the middle of this ancient wind-swept plain, rising from the grass with a quiet and peculiar authority, stands one of the most recognizable and most argued over structures in human history. A circle of enormous stones, some standing, some fallen, some absent entirely, their absence a mystery in its own right. This is Stonehenge, and something like it has been standing here for roughly 5,000 years. 5,000 years. Sit with that number for a moment. 5,000 years ago, the Egyptian pyramids had not yet been built. Writing, the technology that allows human beings to send their thoughts across time, had only recently been invented in Mesopotamia and was entirely unknown in Britain. The Bronze Age was just beginning, and yet here, on this wind-swept Wiltshire plain, people were already gathering, already quarrying stone, already carrying it across enormous distances, already setting it upright with extraordinary precision. They left no explanation, no dedication carved in the rock, no written record of purpose. They built it, they used it, and eventually, over many centuries, they stopped coming, and the stone stood alone with the wind and the rain and the long weight of time pressing down across the millennia. What we know about Stonehenge physically is considerable. The site consists of several distinct phases of construction over more than 1,500 years, a span longer than the interval between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and today. The earliest phase, around 3000 BCE, involved a circular ditch and bank. Later phases introduced the famous blue stones of a distinctive blue-grey rock called spotted dolerite, transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales, approximately 250 miles away. These stones weigh between 2 and 5 tons each. Through watercraft, wooden sledges, ropes, and the organized, sustained labor of many people across multiple generations, they made that journey. What is clear is that the effort was enormous, not a casual project of a few seasons, but a multi-generational commitment of resources and human energy that speaks to the profound importance of this site to the people who built it. Then came the enormous sarsen stones, the massive grey uprights and horizontal lintels most people recognize. From Marlborough Downs, about 25 miles away. Some weigh as much as 25 tons. They were not merely moved, but shaped and fitted. The lintels are connected to the uprights with mortise and tenon joints, a carpentry technique adapted to stone. The lintels are curved in plan to follow the circle.
Someone understood geometry and planned this with care and precision across decades, possibly centuries of construction.
The stones are not placed randomly. The structure is oriented with extraordinary precision towards the sunrise on the summer solstice and the sunset on the winter solstice. On the longest day of the year, standing at the center and looking northeast, the sun rises almost exactly over the heel-stone. On the shortest day, the midwinter sunset aligns through a gap between two of the largest stones. These alignments have been measured, verified, and confirmed repeatedly. They were not accidental. Whoever built Stonehenge understood the movements of the sun with a precision that required years, possibly generations, of patient observation. They knew where the light would fall. They built around that knowledge, encoding it in stone that has outlasted everything else they ever made. The most widely accepted interpretation is that Stonehenge served as a ceremonial site connected to astronomical observation, a gathering place at the solstices where community came together to mark the turning of the year. There is also extensive evidence of burial. Thousands of human cremation deposits have been found in and around the site, dating across several centuries of use. Some individuals buried there had, isotopic analysis shows, spent their lives in Scotland, Wales, or on the European continent before being brought here in death. This suggests a site with a gravity that drew people from across a wide region, a sacred destination, a center of spiritual and communal meaning in the prehistoric world of Britain.
Other theories have gathered around the stones over the centuries, like the English weather, that Stonehenge was a healing site where the sick came seeking recovery, drawn by the blue stone's believed curative powers, that it was primarily a monument to ancestors, a point of contact between the living and the dead, a place where the boundary between worlds felt thin, that it functioned as an elaborate astronomical calendar, tracking the moon's full 18-year cycle. And then there are the older stories, Merlin's magic, giants, visitors from other worlds, stories that say something important not about the stones themselves, but about the depth and consistency of the wonder they produce in everyone who stands among them. There is a quietness to Stonehenge that photographs cannot capture. Standing within the circle in the low light of a grey English afternoon, surrounded by stones that have stood through 5,000 winters and 5,000 summers, through every civilization that has risen and fallen since their placement, you become aware of your own smallness in a way that is not frightening but clarifying. The stones do not care who you are or what century you inhabit. They have watched everything past. They will watch everything that comes next. And in their patience, their absolute geological indifference to human history, there is something profoundly comforting, like a presence that is simply there, simply permanent, simply stubbornly, beautifully, beyond full understanding.
On a grey English evening, when the light is soft and flat, and the grass is very green, and the sky is the colour of old pewter, Stonehenge looks less like a mystery to be solved, and more like a reminder that the world is old, that human beings have always been here, building things for reasons that matter to them, leaving marks on the landscape with whatever tools they had, trying to make something that would last. Stonehenge has lasted. Whatever its builders intended, whatever ceremonies were performed within its circle,
whatever prayers were spoken when the midsummer sun rose over the heelstone, all of that is gone. But the stones remain, and that, perhaps, is its own kind of answer. The Nazca lines, drawings for the sky. In the coastal desert of southern Peru, in a region so dry it receives less than an inch of rain per year, so climatically stable that the surface of the land has barely changed in 2,000 years, there is a gallery carved into the earth itself. It stretches across a plateau roughly 50 miles long and covers nearly 200 square miles. The pictures in this gallery are enormous. They cannot be fully seen from the ground. Some measure hundreds of feet across. The condor extends nearly 400 feet from wingtip to tail. The hummingbird's proportions are accurate enough to identify the species it depicts. A monkey with a spiraling tail spreads across an area larger than most city blocks. And the only way to truly grasp their shapes is to rise into the air above them, to climb high enough that the whole picture resolves itself out of the tangle of pale lines on the reddish-brown desert floor.
From the sky, they are astonishing. Dozens of animal figures. A spider, a whale, a hummingbird, a monkey, a condor, a parrot, a dog, a lizard, humanoid figures. Alongside them, geometric shapes of breathtaking precision, spirals, trapezoids, triangles, and perfectly straight lines that stretch for miles across the desert floor without deviating by a single degree. More than 300 individual geoglyphs have been identified, with new ones still being discovered through aerial and satellite survey. Some of the straight lines are so perfectly aligned that a modern engineer using precision instruments would be proud to have drawn them. These are the Nazca lines, and they have been waiting in the desert for roughly 2,000 years. They were made by the Nazca people, a civilization that flourished in this region from around 100 BCE to about 800 CE. The Nazca were not a primitive culture. They constructed sophisticated underground aqueduct systems called puquillos that channeled water from the Andes foothills into the arid coastal plain, allowing agriculture in a landscape that would otherwise be completely inhospitable. They produced some of the most visually striking and technically accomplished pottery in pre-Columbian South America, decorated with vivid polychrome imagery of the same animals that appear in the desert geoglyphs. They were a culture with a rich ceremonial life, a sophisticated understanding of their environment, and a clearly developed tradition of art that operated at scales beyond any individual's direct vision.
The physical process of making the lines is broadly understood. The Nazca Desert surface is covered in a thin layer of reddish-brown iron oxide-coated pebbles. Beneath this darker upper layer, the soil is considerably lighter. By removing the upper layer of pebbles and piling them into low banks along the sides of the cleared area, the Nazca people created lines and shapes of striking visual contrast, pale against dark, visible from a distance, and remarkably permanent in the virtual absence of rain. The desert's extraordinary climatic stability has protected the lines for 2,000 years. In a wetter or windier climate, they would have been erased within decades. Experimental archaeologists have demonstrated that the lines could have been created using wooden stakes, lengths of rope, and organized teams of workers.
The straight lines could be extended using a simple sighting system, establishing a direction with a stake and rope and walking it forward across the flat desert. Larger animal figures could have been scaled up from smaller drawings using a grid system. Nothing required technology beyond what the Nazca demonstrably possessed. Nothing required an elevated perspective during construction. It required organization, patience, and a collective intention to make something that could not be fully seen from where it was made. The how, in broad strokes, is not entirely mysterious. The why is where the questions live.
The most widely accepted scholarly explanation connects the lines to water and rain ritual. The Nazca lived in one of the most arid environments on Earth, where water was a survival imperative. The shapes may have been offerings, enormous ceremonial drawings made on the surface of the land as a form of collective prayer addressed to the gods who controlled rainfall. The specific animals depicted may have been deliberately symbolic. The monkey, not native to the coastal desert but to the Amazon rainforest, may have symbolized the Amazon's abundant rainfall, a powerful image of the water the coastal people desperately needed. The spider, in many South American indigenous traditions, is a bringer of rain. The straight lines and geometric pathways may have been walked in procession during ritual ceremonies, the act of physically tracing their outlines becoming itself the ceremony, a form of embodied prayer that engaged the whole body, walking the shape of the petition into the desert floor. Other researchers have proposed astronomical functions, that certain figures and lines align to the rising and setting of particular stars, important to the Nazca agricultural and ceremonial calendar. Maria Reich, the German mathematician who devoted much of her adult life to studying and protecting the Nazca lines, living in the desert for decades, measuring and mapping in the fierce Peruvian sun, fighting against encroachment that threatened to damage the geoglyphs, believed deeply in their astronomical significance. Later researchers have both refined and complicated her conclusions. The picture is not simple enough to reduce to a single explanation.
And then there is the theory that refuses to disappear from popular culture, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that the lines were made for visitors from other worlds, that the straight lines were runways for spacecraft, that the animal figures were signals to the sky. This theory has been rejected by professional archaeologists with considerable consistency. The lines show all the signs of human construction, including inconsistencies, corrections, and overlapping designs made at different times. The Nazca people were sophisticated engineers and artists whose abilities are extensively documented. But the theory persists because it is responding to something real, to the scale of the aspiration the Nazca lines represent. These were pictures made for an eye that the people who made them could never occupy. Art created for a perspective they could only imagine. Whether that imagined perspective belonged to gods, to birds, to some visionary sense of the world seen from above, is something we may never know with certainty. But there is something deeply moving in that aspiration, the trust involved in making something beautiful for an audience you cannot verify and cannot see, the commitment involved in working at a scale beyond your own direct experience, trusting in a vision that required imagination as much as observation. That is, in its own way, an act of faith as profound as any prayer.
The lines are protected today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and they have survived remarkably well in the almost unchanging desert climate. But they are fragile. Vehicle tracks made by a single modern truck can damage them permanently. The expansion of agriculture and mining in the surrounding region brings disturbances that conservation authorities work to limit. They have been here for 2,000 years. Whether they survive the next 200 depends on how much we value them, and on how willing we are to let mystery continue to exist in the world, rather than reducing everything to what we already think we understand. Easter Island, the Watchers at the Edge of the World. There is a place so isolated that it strains the imagination to believe anyone ever found it. A small triangular island in the southeastern Pacific Ocean, 14 miles long and 7 miles wide, sitting more than 2,000 miles from the nearest inhabited land. The coast of Chile lies over 2,300 miles to the east. Pitcairn Island to the west is nearly 1,300 miles away. Tahiti to the northwest is over 2,500 miles distant. In every direction, the ocean extends to the horizon and continues being the ocean, enormous, deep, and empty, for a very long time before it encounters anything else. And yet, on this improbable speck of volcanic rock in the middle of the world's largest ocean, there stand nearly 1,000 enormous stone figures, called moai, facing inland with blank and ancient eyes. This is Rapa Nui, known in the West as Easter Island, and it has been asking questions since before the first outsider arrived to try to answer them. The Rapa Nui people navigated to this remote island sometime between 800 and 1200 CE, arriving in double-hulled canoes guided by stars and ocean swells and the flight paths of seabirds, using the navigational knowledge that made the Polynesian people the greatest maritime explorers of the ancient world. The Polynesians colonized islands scattered across a triangle of ocean spanning millions of square miles, consistently moving against the prevailing winds with a deliberateness that required extraordinary accumulated knowledge and extraordinary courage. That they found Easter Island, one of the most remote permanently inhabited places in the history of human settlement, speaks to the sophistication of the Polynesian voyaging tradition, in a way that continues to humble modern navigators who attempt to replicate their crossings. Once they arrived and established themselves, they built a civilization. They cultivated sweet potatoes, taro, bananas, and sugarcane, adapting the island's volcanic soil to their needs. They developed Rongo Rongo, a written script that remains entirely undeciphered to this day. Rongo Rongo is one of only a handful of writing systems known to have been independently developed in human history, and it is the only one whose meaning has been completely and irreversibly lost, because the small number of people who could read it were almost entirely eliminated by the catastrophes of the 19th century. They organized themselves into competing chiefdoms. They developed a rich ceremonial life. And at some point, probably beginning around the 12th century CE, they began carving the moai.
The statues are carved from the volcanic tuff found primarily in the Rano Raraku quarry on the island's eastern side. The quarry is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the world, not because of the finished statues it has yielded, but because of what it still contains. Hundreds of unfinished moai remain in and around it in various stages of completion. Some are still partially attached to the parent rock, carved free on 3 sides, but not yet detached from the volcanic hillside. Some lie on the slopes, apparently abandoned mid-transport. Some stand in the ground, buried to their chins by centuries of accumulated soil. The quarry looks like a production line frozen in time, as if the workers simply put down their tools on an ordinary afternoon and never returned. The finished moai average around 13 feet in height and 14 tons in weight. The tallest standing moai reaches 33 feet. The largest ever carved, which still lies in the quarry unfinished, would have stood nearly 70 feet tall and weighed over 250 tons. The figures depict stylized human forms, large elongated heads, flat noses, strong protruding chins, abbreviated torsos, hands resting against the abdomen. They were placed on stone platforms called ahu around the island, facing inland toward the communities they watched over. Many were fitted with cylindrical red stone topknots, and their eye sockets, discovered in the 1970s to have originally held inlaid coral and obsidian eyes, gave the statues a vivid and watchful expression that empty sockets do not convey. With their eyes in place, lit by the low evening light, these figures would have seemed genuinely alive, presences with attention rather than objects receiving it.
How the moai were moved from the quarry to their platforms, sometimes miles away across rough terrain, is the question that has captivated researchers for centuries. Various experimental approaches have been tested, and the approach demonstrated by archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, that the moai could be moved upright, rocked from side to side using coordinated ropes in a kind of walking motion, turned out to work when experimenters actually tried it with a replica. The statue walked, not quickly, not easily, but it walked. And this method is consistent with Rapa Nui oral tradition, which has always maintained that the moai walked to their positions. The Rapa Nui civilization underwent profound transformation under combined pressures. Deforestation, driven by agriculture, by the need for wood and building material, by introduced rats that devastated native plant life, gradually removed the island's ecological buffer. Competition for diminishing resources fueled conflict between chiefdoms. The moai began to be toppled deliberately in acts of ritual defacement connected to warfare and political upheaval. By the time Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday in 1722, the population had already been reduced from its historical peak, and most statues have been pulled from their platforms. The centuries that followed brought further catastrophe. Peruvian slave raiders in the 1860s carried away a significant portion of the remaining population, including, with devastating consequence, nearly all of those who could still read Rongorongo. By 1877, the entire population of Easter Island had fallen to just 111 people. The living memory of the civilization, its stories, its specialized knowledge, its written language, was shattered almost beyond recovery.
And yet the moai remained, standing or fallen, eroded by centuries of wind and salt spray. They remained. Many have since been re-erected on their platforms. At sunset, when the light turns amber and the shadows of the statues stretch long across the short grass and the Pacific Ocean is visible in every direction, the island has a quality of atmosphere that is genuinely difficult to describe. You are in the presence of something made by human hands across a distance of time so great that it becomes almost physical. The past not behind you, but in front of you, filling the horizon, watching you back. The moai have always watched,
and in the evening light, with the wind moving through the grass and the ocean enormous in every direction, that watching feels less like judgment than like companionship. The quiet, patient company of something very old and very still. The door to hell, fire that never dies. In the middle of the Karakum Desert in central Turkmenistan, under a sky that is usually brilliantly clear and full of stars, there is a hole in the ground that has been on fire for more than 50 years. Roughly 230 feet wide and nearly 100 feet deep, approximately the size of a football field, if the field were a crater of continuous flame, if the surrounding stands were empty desert stretching to every horizon, if the roar of the crowd had been replaced by the low, constant thunder of combustion that has not been interrupted since the early 1970s. This is the Darvaza gas crater, and it is exactly as extraordinary as it sounds. The story of how this crater came to exist is one of those industrial accidents that turned through the slow alchemy of decades and public fascination into something almost mythological. Soviet geologists were conducting drilling operations in this part of the Karakum Desert in the early 1970s, searching for the natural gas deposits known to lie beneath large areas of Turkmenistan, which was then part of the Soviet Union. A drilling rig was positioned over a site that appeared promising, and then the ground gave way. The equipment punctured through into a large underground cavern filled with natural gas, and the ceiling of that cavern, the desert surface above it, collapsed into the void. The rig fell. A crater opened, releasing a cloud of methane, potentially toxic to the workers nearby and to communities in the surrounding region. The geologists made a decision that seemed entirely reasonable in the moment. They set the escaping gas on fire, expecting it to burn off over a few weeks and the situation to resolve itself. That was more than 50 years ago. The fire is still burning. In daylight, the crater is impressive, a churning mass of orange and blue flame filling the floor of the depression, radiating heat you can feel from a considerable distance. The sound at close range is constant and deep, a frequency felt as much as heard, the low, continuous roar of 50 years of uninterrupted combustion. At night, the crater transforms entirely. In the darkness of the Karakum, a genuinely dark desert, far from any significant settlement, under a sky so clear that the Milky Way appears as a solid band of light, the Darvaza crater is the only source of light in every direction. It dominates the landscape completely, pulsing and shifting, painting the dunes in amber and deep orange, casting long moving shadows as the flames shift and breathe beneath the rim. Insects are drawn to it from across the surrounding desert, spiraling down toward the light, as insects have always been drawn to light, toward something far larger and more dangerous than any flame they evolved alongside. Thousands of tourists visit every year, camping in the desert nearby and watching through the night. The experience is described consistently in terms that suggest it bypasses ordinary aesthetic responses and reaches something older and more fundamental, the deep evolutionary relationship between human beings and fire that runs through every culture in history, that connects this crater to the first campfires lit against the first cold nights of human prehistory. Every human culture has gathered around fire.
every human child is drawn to watch flames. The Darvaza crater offers that experience at a scale that is almost cosmological. A fire that has been burning since before some of its current visitors were born. A fire that operates entirely outside human control, that no human decision has yet succeeded in extinguishing. The crater currently measures roughly 230 feet across and 100 feet deep, with internal temperatures regularly exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Recent monitoring data from Turkmenistan's state energy company has suggested that the fires may finally be beginning to diminish, that after more than 50 years, the gas supply is at last showing signs of exhaustion. Whether this represents the beginning of the end for the door to hell or merely a temporary reduction in flow remains to be seen. But the possibility that this fire, which has burned through the entire post-Soviet era, through the independence of Turkmenistan, through half a century of the world changing completely around it, while it simply burned on, might actually go out someday, is itself a kind of reminder. Everything ends. Even the things that seem most committed to their own continuation eventually slow and cool and go quiet. Until that day, the Karakum Desert holds its strange, warm, unwavering light against the night sky, patient as the rock beneath it. Area 51, the desert that answers nothing. Nevada is full of nothing, and that is not an insult. It is an honest geographical description of one of the most dramatically empty landscapes in North America. Flat valley floors of pale gravel, mountain ranges that rise abruptly and disappear into their own bare ridges. The occasional ghost town, a cluster of collapsed wooden buildings given entirely back to the wind and the crows and the slow weathering of the desert sun. The silence out here is total and physical, the kind that settles into your chest, that makes your own heartbeat audible, that makes the sound of a single car on a distant road carry for miles. And somewhere in the middle of this vast, sun-hammered, apparently endless emptiness, roughly 83 miles northwest of Las Vegas, past the point where the paved highway gives way to unmarked dirt roads, there is an Air Force installation that for decades the United States government officially declined to even acknowledge existed. This is Area 51, and it may be the most famous secret in the world. The facility sits on the shore of a dry lake bed called Groom Lake within the Nevada Test and Training Range. It has been in operation since the mid-1950s, established by the Central Intelligence Agency as a development and testing site for advanced reconnaissance aircraft. The context was the Cold War at its most intense. The Soviet Union had detonated nuclear weapons. American intelligence desperately needed reliable information about Soviet military installations. And the aircraft that existed at the time could not safely fly over Soviet territory. What was needed was an aircraft that could fly higher than anything that existed. The answer was the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, designed to fly at altitudes above 70,000 feet, far beyond the reach of any Soviet interceptor jet of the era. At that altitude, a U-2 pilot could photograph an area of ground the size of a small country in a single mission. The aircraft was tested at Groom Lake because the location was extremely remote and the airspace could be easily restricted. Workers were flown in on unmarked aircraft. The facility did not appear on publicly available maps. Officially, it did not exist.
The U-2 performed extraordinarily well until May 1, 1960,
when a U-2 piloted by CIA officer Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union at approximately 70,000 feet, creating an international incident that ended a scheduled superpower summit and revealed the extent of American aerial reconnaissance. But the classified programs at Groom Lake continued, and the aircraft that followed were progressively more remarkable. The A-12 reconnaissance aircraft flew at speeds exceeding 3 times the speed of sound. The F-117 stealth fighter, the first operational aircraft designed to be essentially invisible to radar, was developed and tested there. Whatever has been developed and tested there since is, by definition, the most advanced aerospace technology that the United States currently possesses. The secrecy was and remains necessary, but secrecy creates a vacuum, and vacuums are filled by imagination. Residents of small Nevada towns and ranches began reporting strange lights in the sky above the base, lights that moved in ways no conventional aircraft of the era could replicate, stopping and starting and turning at angles that seemed to violate ordinary physics. These were almost certainly genuine sightings of experimental aircraft performing maneuvers that would have appeared impossible to anyone unfamiliar with what was being tested. But the government couldn't explain the sightings without confirming the classified programs. So the unexplained accumulated, the stories multiplied, and the theorizing expanded to fill the space that explanation refused to occupy.
By the 1980s and 1990s, Area 51 had become the global focal point for a community whose interests were more extraterrestrial than aeronautical. The prevailing narrative held that the base was not merely a testing ground for American military technology, but the storage and reverse engineering site for something recovered from outside human technological tradition, specifically connected to the so-called Roswell incident of July 1947. In which the Army Air Forces initially announced the recovery of a flying disc before revising the statement to describe a weather balloon. Area 51, with its perfect combination of extreme secrecy, documented strangeness, restricted airspace, and remote location, became the natural home for the narrative's elaboration. The CIA formally acknowledged the existence of Area 51 in 2013, when declassified documents confirmed its location and described its history in general terms. Nevada officially designated the highway running along the base's perimeter as the Extraterrestrial Highway. The small town of Rachel nearby hosts the Little Alien, drawing tourists who drive out specifically to stand at the perimeter signs and look at the restricted sky. Those perimeter signs warn in direct terms that trespassing may result in the use of deadly force. Security vehicles maintain a visible and continuous presence. The airspace above the facility remains among the most tightly restricted in the United States.
What is being developed and tested inside Area 51 today is unknown to the public, and will presumably remain so for years. Whatever it is almost certainly as far beyond current civilian aerospace technology as the U-2 was beyond 1950s commercial aviation. The desert keeps its secrets, as it has always kept them, with patience, with heat, with the particular quality of empty sky that reveals nothing and implies everything. And on clear Nevada nights, when a light moves in the sky above the restricted zone in a way that seems to hesitate, to change direction without the arc that conventional aircraft follow. The desert has a way of making you acutely aware of the difference between what you know and what you merely assume.
The forest was named for a shepherd called Bachu, who is said to have entered it with a flock of 200 sheep and never returned. No sheep were ever found, no trace of Bachu was ever recovered. Whether this is historical fact, legend polished by generations of retelling, or some combination of both, is now impossible to determine. But it established the forest's tone from the beginning, and the tone has been maintained with remarkable consistency across every subsequent documented encounter with the place. The trees are the first and most immediately verifiable strangeness. Throughout much of Hoya Baciu, the trees grow in ways that simply do not conform to ordinary patterns of arboreal development. They twist and spiral as they rise, bending at extreme angles before sometimes curving back toward vertical, or simply continuing to grow sideways at angles that should make them structurally unstable, but somehow don't. Some form tight spiral shapes as they grow, coiling almost like corkscrews. Others lean together in groups, their trunks intertwined in ways that look in photographs like deliberate arrangement rather than random growth. Various explanations have been proposed: atypical soil chemistry, irregular underground magnetic fields, unusual patterns of underground water movement, specific patterns of snow accumulation. None has been definitively established. The twisted trees remain, growing in their inexplicable directions, decade after decade.
At the center of the forest is the clearing, roughly circular, about 100 yards across, where nothing grows. Not grass, not weeds, not the pioneer plants that would normally colonize any open ground in a temperate European forest within a single growing season. The soil has been sampled and analyzed repeatedly. Reports consistently show unusual characteristics, including elevated heavy metal concentrations and electromagnetic readings that differ from the surrounding forest. No single explanation has gained scientific consensus. Animals avoid the clearing, an observation made repeatedly by local guides and researchers. Animals do not read about the forest's reputation before visiting it. Their consistent avoidance reflects something in the clearing itself, not in any expectation they bring to it. The forest gained international attention in 1968, when a military technician named Emil Barnier photographed what appeared to be a disc-shaped metallic object in the sky above the trees near the clearing. The photographs were analyzed by multiple researchers over subsequent years and were never definitively identified as any conventional aircraft, natural phenomenon, or known type of optical artifact. They remain among the most discussed and least resolved pieces of photographic evidence in European UFO literature.
What visitors consistently report in Hoya Baciu forms a remarkably stable pattern across 6 decades of documented visitation. Sudden nausea that appears without apparent cause and resolves on leaving the forest. Rashes that appear on exposed skin and fade within hours of departure. Electronic devices losing power within the forest and recovering immediately outside it. A strong and persistent feeling of being watched, and what many describe as a perception of time distortion, the conviction on returning from a walk in the forest that significantly more time has passed than seems to have been experienced. These reports cluster around the same specific symptoms across visitors who have no prior knowledge of the forest's reputation, a consistency difficult to attribute entirely to suggestion or expectation. On a grey afternoon, with the light coming through the canopy at a low angle, the twisted trunks casting complicated shadows, and the clearing visible in the middle distance as a pale oval of bare earth, the forest has a quality of atmosphere that is hard to categorize. Not threatening exactly, not comfortable exactly,
simply very present, a place that seems to push back, gently but persistently, against the idea of being merely background. Socotra Island, the alien garden.
In the Arabian Sea, roughly 240 miles east of the Horn of Africa, there is an island that does not look like anywhere else on Earth. It looks like somewhere else entirely, like a place that diverged from our world at some critical moment long ago and grew in a completely different direction for an almost incomprehensibly long time. A world where the trees spread flat circular canopies like enormous frozen umbrellas against the sky, where the landscape shifts from arid coastal plain to fog-shrouded mountain interior within the space of a short drive, where the air carries the scent of frankincense from trees that have been producing their aromatic resin since long before any human being arrived to harvest it. This is Socotra, and almost everything growing on it exists nowhere else in the world. The strangeness of Socotra is not myth or legend. It is documented, peer-reviewed, rigorously established evolutionary biology. The island has been separated from the Arabian Peninsula, isolated by the opening of the Gulf of Aden, for approximately 18 million years. In that span of time, which is long even by geological standards, the species that colonized Socotra in its early history evolved in complete isolation, cut off from the genetic exchanges and competitive pressures that shaped life elsewhere. The result is an island where roughly 40% of all plant species, more than 350 individual species, are endemic. They exist here and nowhere else on Earth. The island has been called the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean. It is a living laboratory of divergent evolution, a record in living tissue of what happens when life is left entirely to its own devices for an almost incomprehensible span of time.
The most iconic resident of Socotra is the dragon blood tree, Dracana cinnabari, which grows in a shape unlike any other tree in the world, and which has become, in photographs and travel writing, the single image most associated with the island's otherworldly quality. The trunk is thick, smooth and grey-brown, and it divides and redivides as it rises, branching repeatedly until the tips end in a dense, flat, precisely rounded canopy of dark, stiff, spike-like leaves. The canopy spreads horizontally rather than upward, forming a perfect disc or umbrella shape, unlike the crown of any other tree species on Earth. From below, looking up through the branches, you see a ceiling of leaves and a circle of sky. From the side, the tree looks like the product of a mind working from a description of what trees are supposed to do, rather than from direct experience of actual trees. From a hillside, looking down over a rocky Socotri plateau, covered in hundreds of dragonblood trees, the landscape looks alien in a way that is genuinely and completely different from the way any other landscape on Earth looks alien. It looks with considerable precision like a science fiction illustration, like the surface of another world, and it is growing in real soil, under a real sky, in the real light of the real Arabian Sea sun.
The name dragon blood tree comes not from any fearsome quality of the tree itself, but from the deep crimson resin it produces when its bark is cut. This resin, brilliantly red, sticky, thick, was one of the most valuable and widely traded commodities in the ancient world. Used as a pigment by painters and craftspeople, as medicine for everything from wound treatment to fever, and as a varnish for wooden objects, including, famously, Stradivarius violins. Arab traders and early European merchants who encountered it saw that vivid red liquid bleeding from cut grey bark and called it exactly what it looked like: the blood of a dragon. Socotra hosts many other extraordinary plants alongside the dragon blood tree. The desert rose stores water in an enormously swollen bulbous trunk, producing clusters of vivid pink flowers at the tips of otherwise completely bare branches, flowers emerging from what appears, outside the flowering season, to be a collection of dead sticks growing from a large grey-green ball. The visual effect is striking enough to seem deliberately artistic. Giant succulents, frankincense trees tapped for their resin for at least 3,000 years, a cucumber tree producing fleshy, water-rich fruits, hundreds of other species, each adapted in its own specific way to the island's particular conditions, each the product of millions of years of evolution, without external influence or interference.
These Socotra people, approximately 50,000 individuals, are as distinctive as the flora and fauna around them. They speak Socotra, a modern South Arabian language related to Arabic but sufficiently different to be largely incomprehensible to Arabic speakers without specific study. Socotra was an entirely oral language for virtually the whole of its history. It had no written form until linguists and community members began developing one collaboratively in recent decades. This means that the entire accumulated knowledge of the Socotra people, their understanding of the island's plants and animals and their medicinal and practical uses, their history and their stories and their ceremonial traditions, was carried entirely in human memory and in the spoken word. The depth of Socotra botanical knowledge, detailed understanding of hundreds of endemic plant species accumulated over millennia of living on this unique island, is something that outside researchers have been working for decades to document before it is lost.
Socotra's recent decades have been ones of increasing external attention alongside increasing vulnerability. The island was protected for most of its history by its physical remoteness. Regular monsoon winds cut off sea access for several months each year, limiting outside contact to accessible seasons, and preserving the island's ecology from many of the pressures that have damaged biodiversity elsewhere. That protection has been eroding. Yemen's ongoing conflict has created political instability, complicating conservation. Cyclones in 2015 and 2018, unprecedented in the island's recorded history, and almost certainly connected to changing Indian Ocean weather patterns, caused significant damage to the dragonblood tree populations. The trees still stand on the plateau. The frankincense still bleeds. The endemic birds still call from the canopy, but the future of this alien garden, this product of 18 million years of solitary evolution, is less certain than at almost any point in its extraordinary history. The Eye of the Sahara, a scar you can only see from space.
In the Sahara Desert of Mauritania, in the vast, hot, sparsely inhabited northwest of Africa, there is a geological formation that was always present but was never properly seen until human beings developed the ability to leave the surface of the earth and look back at it from above. From the ground, standing within it, it appears to be a landscape of eroded ridges and dry valleys, visually interesting perhaps, but not obviously extraordinary. From aircraft at moderate altitude, a pattern begins to emerge, though its scale is difficult to grasp. But from orbit, from the perspective of an astronaut looking down from the International Space Station, it resolves into something simultaneously unmistakable and deeply strange.
a perfect set of concentric rings, like a bullseye etched into the desert by a hand working at geological scale, roughly 30 miles from outer rim to outer rim, ancient beyond any human framework for measuring time, and looking from that particular altitude exactly as though it was placed there with intention. This is the Richat structure, known popularly as the Eye of the Sahara, sometimes as the Eye of Africa. It is one of the most visually distinctive features of the African continent when seen from space. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station have described it as a reliable navigation landmark during orbital passes, a feature so geometrically distinctive that it can be recognized immediately from altitude, even through atmospheric haze that softens most surface features when viewed from orbit. Its perfect circular symmetry, at a scale covering nearly 800 square miles, makes it stand out from the surrounding Saharan landscape with a clarity that no amount of familiarity with it fully dispels.
The structure consists of a series of concentric ridges and valleys alternating in bands from the center outward, like wings in a cross-section of a tree. The rocks of different rings are of different ages and compositions. The innermost zone contains rocks over 1,000 million years old, while the outer rings consist of progressively younger formations. Different rock types erode at different rates under the Saharan sun and wind, and this differential erosion creates the alternating high ridges and low valleys that produce the concentric ring appearance from above. At the very center, the geology is dramatically disrupted, fractured, folded, uplifted, speaking to tremendous forces active in the geological past. For many years after the structure was first properly documented, the most popular explanation was that it was an impact crater, the remnant of a large meteorite striking the Earth at high velocity, compressing and displacing the rock in the characteristic ring pattern such impacts produce. Impact craters on Earth, the Moon, and Mars do display concentric ring structures similar to what the Richat shows. The hypothesis was intuitive, visually compelling, and consistent with the structure's general form. Extensive geological investigation has since established that the Richat structure is almost certainly not an impact crater. The critical evidence against this hypothesis is the absence of shocked quartz, a form of quartz that forms only under the extreme pressures generated by hypervelocity meteorite impact, and which is found at virtually every confirmed impact site on Earth. No shocked quartz has been found at the Richat, nor have impact melt glasses or other characteristic products of a high-energy cosmic impact been identified. The current geological consensus is that the structure represents a deeply eroded dome, a place where geological forces within the Earth push the crust upward into a broad circular shape over millions of years, and where subsequent erosion by ancient rivers and wind, working over hundreds of millions of additional years, stripped the upper layers away to expose the older, harder rocks of the dome's core. The circular symmetry of the result reflects the circular symmetry of the original upwelling. This is a geologically satisfying and well-supported explanation, but understanding it does not fully eliminate the experience of looking at the Eye of the Sahara and feeling that it looks deliberate, because it does look deliberate. From the right altitude, it looks exactly like something made, not eroded, but placed. And this intuition, however thoroughly the geological explanation addresses the underlying facts, has generated a different kind of theorizing that has found a very large popular audience in recent years. The most widely circulated of these alternative theories proposes that the Richat structure is the physical remains of Atlantis,
the legendary civilization described by Plato in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, set on a large island composed of concentric rings of land and water, destroyed by a catastrophic inundation. The argument notes that the Richat structure's concentric ring form resembles Plato's description, that geological evidence suggests the structure was covered by shallow seawater at some point in the distant past, and that the dimensions Plato provides are roughly consistent with the structure's scale. This theory has been viewed with considerable skepticism by classical scholars, archaeologists, and geologists. Plato's account of Atlantis is widely understood among classicists to be either a philosophical allegory or a heavily fictionalized echo of some real but distant historical event, not a geographically specific document intended as literal history. The absence of any archaeological evidence of a major ancient civilization of the site is the most immediate practical problem. But the theory's persistence speaks to the hold the eye of the Sahara exercises on the imagination. It looks, from the right distance, exactly as though something should be there. And in that gap between what the evidence shows and what the eye insists it perceives, the mystery finds room to breathe. The Plain of Jars, a field full of questions.
In the mountainous interior of Laos, on the Shengquang Plateau, a landscape of green rolling hills and river valleys that feels far from any obvious center of ancient power, there are fields with jars, not small jars, enormous stone jars, some standing nearly 10 feet tall and weighing as much as 14 tons, carved from solid rock and arranged in clusters across the plateau. More than 2,000 individual jars have been documented at over 90 sites. They have been here for at least 2,000 years, and no one has produced a fully satisfying explanation of what they were for. The Shengquang Plateau was among the most heavily bombed territories in the history of aerial warfare. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States conducted a covert bombing campaign over Laos, dropping more than 2 million tons of ordnance, more explosive weight than was dropped on all of Germany during the entirety of the Second World War. A significant portion of the bombs that were dropped, estimates suggest around 30%, did not explode on impact. They remain in the soil of the plateau today, still live, still dangerous. The Plain of Jars has been designated one of the most heavily contaminated unexploded ordnance zones in the world, and this contamination has profoundly limited archaeological investigation for decades.
The jars vary considerably in size, rock type, and quality of workmanship, suggesting they were created over an extended period by different groups of people using locally available stone. Most are simple cylinders, broader at the base and tapering slightly toward the top, their openings suggesting they were designed to be covered. Stone lids have been found at several sites. Some jars show traces of carved decorations, largely worn away by 2,000 years of tropical weather and only partially legible. Archaeological excavations, conducted carefully in limited areas where UXO clearance has been completed, have found human remains in and around the jars at multiple sites. Cremated bone fragments, burial goods, including glass beads and ceramics, evidence suggesting connection to death, burial, and the rituals surrounding the transition from life to whatever came afterward. The dominant scholarly interpretation is that the jars were connected to a funerary tradition practiced by an Iron Age culture roughly 2,000 years ago. This culture is not precisely identified in the historical record. It predates the major kingdoms of mainland Southeast Asia and left no written documentation.
The jars may have served as containers for the remains of the dead, or for offerings made to the dead, or as locations of ceremony connected to the process of death and transformation.
Local traditions offer alternative explanations. One widely known story describes the jars as the drinking vessels of a race of giants who once inhabited the plateau, cups sized appropriately for people of enormous stature. Another connects them to a historical king named Kun Jewam, who ordered them made to hold rice wine brewed in celebration of a great military victory. Neither is treated as literal history by archaeologists, but both speak to how the Laotian people have incorporated these ancient and inexplicable objects into a living tradition of story and meaning. UNESCO designated the Plain of Jars as a World Heritage Site in 2019. Those who make the journey, navigating the carefully marked safe paths between the jar clusters, describe the experience as one of the more quietly extraordinary they have encountered. You stand beside a jar carved 2,000 years ago by someone whose name is gone, from a culture whose language and beliefs are largely inaccessible to us. The stone is cold even in the warm afternoon. Grass grows around its base. A bird calls from somewhere in the surrounding trees. The green hills stretch away. And in that stillness, in that very ordinary moment of presence beside something ancient and incomprehensible, the distance between your world and the world that made these jars becomes briefly, improbably small. North Sentinel Island, the island that refuses the world.
In the Bay of Bengal, belonging administratively to India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands chain, there is a small island, roughly 23 square miles in extent, densely forested from its interior to its shoreline, surrounded by shallow coral reefs and open water. It sits within sight of other Andaman Islands. Helicopter flight paths and shipping lanes pass within miles of it, and yet it is, in the most meaningful sense of the word, entirely separate from the world that surrounds it. Its inhabitants, the Sentinelese, have maintained this separation with absolute consistency across every contact attempt in recorded history. They wish to be left alone. They have communicated this wish in the most direct language available to them: arrows shot at approaching boats and helicopters, clear hostility shown to any person who attempts to set foot on their shore. And after decades of attempting to establish contact, the Indian government has accepted the message. The law now reflects it. The Sentinelese are one of the last peoples on Earth who have maintained genuine separation from global civilization. The phrase uncontacted people is used carefully by anthropologists and indigenous rights organizations because it does not mean what it might seem to mean. The Sentinelese are clearly aware that other people exist. They have seen ships, aircraft and boats for generations, have had objects washed ashore from the outside world, have been close enough to outsiders on several documented occasions to make their objections known. They are not unaware of the world beyond their island. They have simply made a consistent, multi-generational, apparently intentional choice not to be part of it.
The history of contact attempts extends back to the earliest British presence in the Andaman Islands in the 19th century. British surveying expeditions encountered hostility. Indian government attempts through the late 20th century met a range of responses, from outright arrow shooting to a period in the late 1980s and early 1990s when official contact teams were able to approach closely enough to leave gifts of coconuts on the beach and receive what appeared to be cautious and tentative acceptance. These contact attempts were permanently discontinued in 1996. Two considerations drove the decision. The first was disease risk. Isolated populations have no acquired immunity to common infectious diseases, and a single infected visitor can potentially introduce pathogens that spread catastrophically through a population with no previous exposure. The history of the Andaman Islands provides deeply sobering context. The great Andamanese people, once a substantial and culturally rich population, were devastated by introduced disease following British colonization, their numbers reduced from thousands to a small remnant community within just a few decades. The Sentinelese avoided this fate partly through their consistent hostility to outside contact. Their arrows, in a deeply uncomfortable historical irony, may have been protecting them from something far more dangerous than anything their arrows could inflict. The second consideration was the community's expressed preference. The Sentinelese had made clear, through every form of communication available to them, that they did not want contact. Indian law now prohibits approaching within 5 nautical miles of North Sentinel Island, and this prohibition is enforced. The protection is taken seriously.
In November 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Shaw was killed attempting to reach the Sentinelese. He had been warned away by arrows on an initial approach and returned the following day. Indian authorities chose not to seek prosecution of any Sentinelese individuals, citing the island's protected status. The incident generated substantial international coverage and uncomfortable debate about missionary practice, indigenous rights, and the appropriate relationship between global civilization and communities that have chosen to remain outside it. These are not simple questions, but the Sentinelese did not participate in the debate. They remained, as they have always remained, exactly where they are. What the Sentinelese know, what they believe, what stories they tell about the world beyond their island, and the strange beings who periodically appear on its horizon, none of this is accessible to us. We do not know their language. We do not know their social organization, their cosmology, their understanding of their own history. We know only what they have shown us, that they are alive, that they have survived, and that they are prepared to maintain their boundary by whatever means are necessary. There is something in that consistency, in that unambiguous, uncompromising, multi-generational commitment to remaining apart, that commands a kind of respect. The boundary is clear, the message is consistent, and in a world where every community is under increasing pressure to connect and integrate and participate, whether they choose to or not, the existence of one small island where that pressure has been refused firmly, clearly, across generations, is something worth sitting with quietly.
Along the Atlantic coast of Namibia, in the ancient and extraordinarily arid Namib Desert, there is a pattern in the landscape that extends for roughly 1,000 miles from north to south and up to 100 miles from east to west. It covers an area larger than most European countries. It has been present, as far as current scientific understanding can determine, for at least 2,000 years, and possibly considerably longer. And it is unlike anything else in the natural world. The pattern consists of circles, bare, roughly circular patches of ground, each surrounded by a fringe of slightly taller and healthier grass than the surrounding desert vegetation, each maintaining its shape with a regularity that seems to refuse the explanation of random natural variation. The circles range in size from a few feet to more than 30 feet in diameter. They are distributed across the Namib not randomly, but with a strange evenness, not crowded, not isolated, but spaced with a consistency that gives the desert floor, in aerial photographs, the appearance of something organized, something patterned, something that is, in a word that keeps suggesting itself despite rational resistance, breathing. The local San people have called these formations fairy circles, associated in San tradition with the gods of the land, with the spirits that move through the desert, for longer than written records exist. The name has been adopted into scientific usage, one of those happy accidents where the most appropriate and the most beautiful turn out to be the same name.
The circles are real. They have been measured, documented, photographed at every scale, and studied by multiple research teams from multiple disciplines over several decades. Their basic physical characteristics are well established. The bare central patches contain no vegetation of any kind. The perimeter grass is measurably more vigorous than the surrounding grassland. The circles have a life cycle. They appear, maintain their shape and size for roughly 30 to 60 years, and then gradually fill in as surrounding vegetation colonizes the bare patch from the edges inward. New circles form elsewhere, maintaining roughly the same density and distribution pattern across the landscape. The pattern is dynamic, living, continuously regenerating itself across the ancient desert at a pace too slow for human perception to easily register. The scientific debate about the origin of the fairy circles was one of the more engaging controversies in ecology of the past 20 years. Two competing hypotheses dominated the discussion. The first proposed sand termites, a species that consumes grass roots within a patch of ground to create a bare area that retains soil moisture, benefiting the colony. The circles are, in this view, functional structures, maintained for the ecological benefit of their builders. The second proposed that the circles arise from a purely physical process of vegetation self-organization, without any involvement from animals. In arid environments, plants compete for soil moisture, each consuming water from the ground around it and creating a zone where neighboring plants cannot easily survive. Mathematical models of this kind of vegetation competition predict that under certain conditions of aridity, the vegetation will spontaneously organize into the kind of evenly spaced patterns of bare patches and vegetated areas that the Namibian fairy circles display. Research published in 2017 found evidence that both mechanisms are simultaneously active and appear to reinforce each other. The termite activity and the vegetation competition dynamics are not competing explanations, but complementary ones. They interact and amplify each other to produce the pattern. This is an ecologically complex finding, representing the kind of answer that makes a natural phenomenon more interesting rather than less, revealing a depth of interacting causation that a single-factor explanation would have obscured. Similar formations have since been discovered in parts of Australia's outback and in arid regions of the Middle East,
produced in somewhat different ecological contexts, but following the same broad principles of vegetation self-organization under water stress. The fairy circle phenomenon appears to be a general pattern, a common outcome of certain types of dry land ecosystem dynamics. None of which diminishes the experience of standing in the Namibian fairy circle landscape. The circles stretch away in every direction, pale and bare against the surrounding grass, regular and patient. The Namib is one of the oldest deserts on Earth, dry for perhaps 55 million years. And in this ancient, dry place, these circles continue to form and dissolve and reform, as they apparently have for millennia, following the slow logic of soil moisture and insect behavior and the fundamental competition of living things for scarce resources, indifferent to whether anyone is watching, indifferent to whether anyone understands. There is something in that indifference, in that patient, biologically driven patterning of the ancient desert floor, that is its own kind of mystery. Not the mystery of the supernatural, but the mystery of scale, of processes so much larger and longer than individual human experience, that they acquire from the inside something of the quality of the inexplicable.
At the mouth of the Catatumbo River, where it enters Lake Maracaibo in northwestern Venezuela, there is a storm. Not occasionally, not seasonally. Between 140 and 160 nights per year, nearly half the nights of every year, year after year, lightning blazes and flickers and blazes again in the sky above the river's mouth. At its peak intensity, the storm produces up to 40 lightning bolts per minute. Scientific measurement has established that this location receives more lightning strikes per square kilometer per year than anywhere else on Earth. The lightning comes as the darkness falls. It stays through much of the night. The sky above the lake burns with cold electric fire in the darkness. And then the sun rises and the storm retreats. And then the darkness comes again and the lightning returns.
The Catatumbo lightning, Relampago del Catatumbo, has been documented and written about since at least the 16th century, when Spanish colonial accounts described a perpetual light above Lake Maracaibo that served mariners as a navigation reference, visible far out at sea, a natural lighthouse marking the entrance to the lake. The explorer and naturalist Alexander von Humboldt documented it in the early 19th century, marveling at its geographical specificity. The way the lightning was concentrated over the river mouth rather than distributed across the broader sky, as if some organizing principle were directing it to this particular point. The Catatumbo lightning appears on the coat of arms and flag of the Venezuelan state of Zulia. It appears in Venezuelan poetry as the lighthouse of Maracaibo. It is woven into the cultural identity of the region in ways that go considerably deeper than simple local pride. It is a feature of the landscape that has been present, consistent, and reliable for as long as any person living in the region can remember, or any ancestor before them.
The scientific explanation for why this particular corner of northwestern Venezuela generates such extraordinary, reliable, and geographically concentrated lightning involves the specific combination of topographic and atmospheric factors converging at precisely this location. Lake Maracaibo, one of the largest bodies of water in South America, covering approximately 5,000 square miles, and one of the oldest lakes in the world, generates enormous evaporation,
releasing water vapor into the air in quantities that create a persistently unstable and moisture-saturated atmospheric column. This warm, wet, unstable air is surrounded on three sides by the Andes Mountains and their foothills, which channel the cooler, denser air descending from the mountains into convergent flows directed toward the lake surface. Where these air masses collide, warm, moisture-laden, rapidly rising air from the lake meeting cool, dense, descending air from the mountains, the conditions for powerful convective thunderstorms are created with a regularity that would be remarkable anywhere else in the world. The Catatumbo River Valley contributes specifically to the localization of the lightning, providing a pathway for cool mountain air to descend toward the lake that intensifies the convergence at precisely the point where the river meets the lake. This is why the lightning is concentrated over the river mouth rather than distributed across the full lake surface. Move a few miles in any direction and the lightning is less frequent. Stand at the river's mouth and look up, and the sky performs its extraordinary nightly show directly overhead.
In early 2010, the ordinary pattern was broken. An El Niño weather event brought severe drought to the region. The Catatumbo lightning went silent. For approximately 6 weeks, the longest interruption in the phenomenon's recorded modern history, the sky above the lake was dark at night. No lightning, no sound, no light reflected on the water. The absence was noticed and written about immediately. Local communities, the fishing communities on the shores of Lake Maracaibo, the farmers of the surrounding countryside, the people whose grandparents and great-grandparents had grown up beneath the same nightly display, described the experience with words that had nothing to do with meteorology. They described unease, a wrongness, the absence of something that had always been there, which is different from the absence of something you merely enjoyed. When the rains returned and the lightning resumed, the relief was real, palpable, communal. The eternal storm came back. The lighthouse of Maracaibo was lit again.
The lightning is not merely spectacle. It contributes to the ecology of the surrounding region. Lightning discharges fix atmospheric nitrogen. They break nitrogen molecules apart in ways that allow them to combine with other elements and fall with rain as nitrogen compounds that living organisms can use. This process, atmospheric nitrogen fixation by lightning, is one of the pathways by which terrestrial ecosystems receive the nitrogen they need to sustain plant growth and biological productivity. The Catatumbo lightning, producing its extraordinary density of discharges over this specific region nearly every night of the year, contributes a disproportionate share of the lightning-fixed nitrogen that falls on the northwestern Venezuelan ecosystem. It is part of the land's fertility, part of the mechanism by which this corner of South America sustains its biological richness. The lightning is not just beautiful, it is functional in the deepest ecological sense. And standing on the shore of Lake Maracaibo on a clear night, watching the sky above the Catatumbo river mouth perform its display, the lightning constant and multiple, sometimes branching in simultaneous arcs across the entire visible sky, the thunder rolling across the water seconds later in long, low, resonant waves, you understand at some level below articulation why this phenomenon has been written about and painted and put on flags for centuries. It is simply one of the most remarkable things the Earth routinely does. One of those moments when the planet reveals an aspect of itself that seems designed to be witnessed. And all you have to do is be there and be quiet and watch.
We have traveled far tonight, from the deep dark waters of the Bermuda Triangle, where the Gulf Stream carries its secrets north through 500,000 square miles of legend, to the wind-swept plain of Wiltshire, where 5,000 years of patient stone hold the memory of ceremonies we can no longer name, from the pale desert plateau of southern Peru, where a civilization drew pictures for an eye it could never occupy, to the edge of the Pacific, where stone figures stand on a volcanic island and watch the horizon with blank ancient patience, from a burning crater in the Karakum Desert, where an accidental fire has been burning for longer than most of us have been alive, to the restricted Nevada Desert, where the empty sky says nothing and the signs say keep out, from a Romanian forest where the trees grow in spirals and the clearing at its center stays bare through every growing season, to an island in the Arabian Sea where evolution built its alien garden in private for 18 million years, from a circular scar in the African rock visible only from orbit, to a plateau in Laos where 2,000 ancient jars wait in the grass with a patience that puts human impatience to shame, from a small island in the Bay of Bengal where a people have refused the world for its whole recorded history, to the ancient Namibian desert where the circles breathe in and breathe out, and to a Venezuelan lake where the lightning comes back every night, faithful as the turning of the earth.
Every single one of these places is real. They are here, on the same planet where you are resting tonight. They are not separated from you by imagination or distance in any final sense. They exist in the same world you will wake up into tomorrow, and they will still be there, still holding their questions, still patient with the not knowing, still waiting, long after any single human life has run its course. What strikes me most about the world's most mysterious places is not their strangeness exactly, it is their patience. The Nazca lines have waited 2,000 years for a complete explanation and show no sign of impatience with the wait. Stonehenge has stood through 5,000 winters without once feeling the apparent need to clarify its purpose. The Moai have watched their horizons across 9 centuries of wind and light without explaining themselves. The fairy circles form and dissolve and reform on a timescale that makes human history feel brief. Mystery does not require resolution to survive. It does not need your urgency or your anxiety or your demand that it deliver an answer before you can rest. It simply is. And in being what it is, incomplete, unresolved, breathing in the space between the understood and the not yet understood, it offers something that certainty never quite manages to provide. It offers openness, the particular, spacious, quiet openness of a question that hasn't been answered yet, the feeling of a door not quite closed, of a story still in progress, of a world that is larger and stranger and more various than any mind can hold at once.
That openness is not a problem. It is a gift. The world is still mysterious. The earth still keeps its secrets. There are still places where the ground does things that surprise us, where the sky behaves in ways that science hasn't fully mapped, where human beings made things thousands of years ago whose meaning we are still patiently working to understand. That means the world is still generous, still offering new forms of astonishment to anyone patient enough to seek them, still whispering things at the edge of what we know that we can almost make out, if we're quiet enough.
And you can be quiet now. You are already quiet. You are already in that soft, unhurried space between waking and sleeping, where questions lose their urgency and images drift like slow clouds. Let these places settle around you gently, not as problems to be solved, not as puzzles demanding attention, but simply as presences. The broad, dark water of the Bermuda Triangle under a sky full of stars. The cold, grey stone of Stonehenge in the early morning light, dew on the grass, birds calling somewhere in the distance. The pale Nazca Desert stretching away in every direction under a sky of impossible blue. The Pacific horizon as seen from Easter Island at the moment the light turns golden. The orange glow of the Darvaza fire pulsing against the Karakum darkness. The Nevada desert silent and cold and brilliant with stars. The Hoya Baciu trees twisted in their still and watching shapes. The dragon blood trees spreading their umbrella canopies against the Arabian sky. The eye of the Sahara turning its ancient face upward. The jars quiet in their green Laotian field. The beach of North Sentinel Island empty in the afternoon light. The Namibian circles breathing their slow and ancient breath. And above the lake in Venezuela, the lightning on and on and on. The sky alive with cold electric light above the still water, regular as a heartbeat, faithful as the returning dawn.
Let these images drift. Let them soften at the edges. Let the sounds of those places, the soft Atlantic swell, the Wiltshire wind, the desert silence, the low continuous roar of fire, the crack and roll of thunder across a Venezuelan lake, blend into something that is less like sound and more like the memory of sound, something that carries no urgency and no demand and no requirement that you do anything at all except be here. Simply the sound of the world breathing in the night, the planet turning beneath you, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient, patient paths, and you here, warm and safe and comfortable, very small in a very large and still mysterious world, at the end of a day that is done.
Part of the answer lies in the specific emotional geography of the ocean. The sea has always occupied a particular position in the human imagination. It is the oldest boundary, the oldest unknown, the thing that lies beyond the edge of the known world on every map ever made before the era of satellites.
ancient cartographers filled their oceans with monsters, not out of ignorance exactly, but out of an honest acknowledgement that the sea was a place where the rules that governed the land did not necessarily apply. Things happened out there. People went out and didn't come back. Ships left harbors and were simply never seen again. This was not legend. This was the ordinary reality of oceanic travel before modern navigation, before radar, before satellite positioning systems, before radio communication. The sea swallowed people regularly, and there was nothing mysterious about it in any supernatural sense. It was simply enormous and powerful and indifferent, and human beings and their wooden ships were fragile things in the face of it. What the Bermuda Triangle does in this context is give a name and a location to that general oceanic anxiety. It takes the diffuse, ancient, entirely rational fear of the sea and concentrates it into a specific place, a specific triangle of coordinates on a chart, a specific set of stories that can be collected and catalogued and worried over. The fear becomes manageable when it becomes specific, when you can point to it on a map and say, there, that is where the dangerous thing lives. You have, in some paradoxical way, made it less threatening. Because the rest of the ocean, by implication, is safe. Only the triangle is dangerous. Only those coordinates.
This is almost certainly not true, as the research has consistently shown. The ocean is equally dangerous everywhere, which is to say it is everywhere capable of destroying the vessels and the lives that venture into it, given the right combination of weather and error and bad luck. But the myth persists because the need it serves is real, even if the specific geography is not. The need to locate the unknown, the need to give danger a specific address, the need to say, we know where the mystery lives, and it lives over there, and here, tonight, we are safe. The Bermuda Triangle is, in this reading, less a geographical feature of the Atlantic and more a feature of the human mind, a place we have built and furnished and populated with all the anxiety and wonder and unresolved fear that the ocean has always generated in us. That doesn't make it less interesting. If anything, it makes it more interesting. Because what the Bermuda Triangle really shows us is how powerfully the human imagination works to make sense of the world, to give shape to the shapeless, to insist on meaning even in the face of randomness. We are meaning-making creatures. Even when the facts don't quite support the meaning we're making, the making itself tells us something important about who we are. A closer look at Stonehenge, what the silence actually sounds like. One thing that tends to get lost in discussions of Stonehenge, in all the archaeological debate and the astronomical speculation and the Arthurian mythology, is the simple experience of being there. And that experience is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is genuinely and reliably different from the experience of being almost anywhere else on Earth.
The first thing you notice, standing within the circle on a quiet morning, is that the stones make a particular kind of silence. This sounds paradoxical. Stones do not make sounds, and silence is, by definition, the absence of sound. But there is a quality to the quiet within the circle that is different from the quiet outside it, a quality created partly by the physical arrangement of the stones, which break the wind differently depending on where you stand, and partly by something that is harder to name, a sense of enclosure, a sense of having stepped inside something that has its own atmosphere, its own temperature,
its own relationship to the sky above and the ground below. The stones themselves are not smooth and clean as they appear in photographs taken in bright sunlight. They are complex surfaces covered in lichen, grey and orange and pale green, that has been growing there for centuries. They have pits and hollows weathered into them by 5,000 years of rain. They have texture and depth that you can only fully appreciate by getting close to them, by pressing your hand against the sarsen surface and feeling the roughness of it, the geological reality of it, the absolute physicality of something that has been standing in this field since before any living tradition in Britain began.
The sound of Stonehenge, when the wind is low and the visitors are few, is mostly birds, rooks in the distance, occasional skylarks overhead in summer, their thin, sustained song carrying across the plain, the rustle of long grass in the field beyond the outer boundary, and beneath all of that, when you are still enough to hear it, the very low, almost inaudible sound of the wind moving through the gaps between the standing stones, a sound that changes as you move, that is different on each side of each stone, that is not quite music, but is not quite not music either. This is what 5,000 years of standing in a field sounds like, if you are quiet enough to hear it. Not dramatic, not supernatural, just present, just ancient, just there, in the way that the oldest things are there, occupying their space with a completeness and a certainty that nothing newer manages to quite replicate. A closer look at Easter Island, the civilization that watched itself change. One of the things that makes Easter Island so haunting, beyond the physical strangeness of the Moai, is the completeness of its story, the arc of the Rapa Nui civilization, from the extraordinary ambition of the Moai building era, through the ecological crisis that followed, to the devastation of European contact, and the long, slow, partially successful process of cultural recovery that continues to this day, is one of the most complete and most legible stories of civilizational rise, transformation, and survival in the archaeological record.
The Rapa Nui did not simply build the Moai and then disappear. They built the Moai and then they changed. The great stone building tradition ended, but the people did not end with it. They adapted, reorganized, developed new ceremonial practices to replace the ones that the toppling of the statues had disrupted. The Birdman cult that replaced the Moai tradition in the island's cultural life was complex and demanding in its own right. A competitive annual ceremony in which clan representatives raced to retrieve the first sooty tern egg of the season from a nearby islet, the winner becoming the sacred Birdman for the following year, and his clan gaining rights to the island's resources. This was not a culture in collapse. This was a culture in transformation, finding new ways to organize itself and give meaning to collective life under changed conditions. The destruction brought by 19th century slave raids and introduced disease was genuinely catastrophic, reducing the population to levels that threatened cultural continuity in a way that the earlier ecological and political transformations had not. But even that was not the end. The Rapa Nui community survived, the language survived, the oral traditions survived in fragmentary form, and the slow recovery of cultural knowledge and cultural pride that has continued across the 20th and 21st centuries is itself a remarkable story.
The story of a community reassembling itself, reclaiming its history, insisting on its own continuity and its own distinctiveness in the face of forces that came very close to erasing it entirely.
The Moai in this context are not just archaeological puzzles or tourist attractions. They are the surviving physical record of a civilization's most ambitious period, the period when the Rapa Nui committed the full weight of their collective resources and their collective ingenuity to making something that would last. The statues have lasted, the people have lasted, the questions they generate have lasted. And at sunset on that small island in the middle of the Pacific, all of that, the ambition and the tragedy and the survival and the enduring mystery, is present in the air, in the light, in the long shadows the statues cast across the grass. It is, if you let it be, one of the most moving places in the world. There is a broader point that the fairy circles of Namibia make, one that goes beyond the specific question of whether it's the termites or the grass dynamics or some combination of both that produces the circles. The broader point is about pattern, and about what pattern means in a biological world.
We are accustomed as human beings to thinking of pattern as the product of intention. When we see a pattern, a repeating shape, an organized arrangement, a structure that appears too regular to be random, our minds instinctively reach for a mind behind it. Someone made this, someone planned this. The pattern implies a planner. This is one of the oldest and most reliable cognitive shortcuts that human beings use to navigate the world, and it served our ancestors extremely well in environments where patterns in grass or forest genuinely did often indicate the presence of another animal or another person. The mind that sees a face in the shadows and runs is more likely to survive than the mind that looks more carefully and gets eaten. But the fairy circles of Namibia are a demonstration that pattern can emerge from processes that have no intention behind them at all. The circles are not planned by anyone. They are not maintained by anyone. They are not the product of any organizing intelligence. They are the visible surface of a dynamic system of interactions between grassroots and soil moisture and termite behavior and rainfall and the specific physics of how water moves through sandy soil in an arid environment. Interactions that follow the laws of physics and biology with perfect consistency, producing the circles as an emergent property of those interactions over time. No plan, no designer, no meaning in the human sense of that word. Just the world doing what the world does, which happens in this instance to produce something that looks from a distance exactly like intention. This is not a deflating observation. It is, if anything, an expanding one. It means that the world is more creative than we give it credit for, that the same processes of physics and chemistry and biology that produce rocks and weather and organisms and ecosystems are also capable, given the right conditions, of producing what looks for all the world like art. The fairy circles are art that no one made. They are beauty that emerged from competition and cooperation at the microscopic level. Beauty that is the aggregate result of billions of individual interactions between roots and soil particles and water molecules and insect mandibles. Beauty that no single participant in those interactions could have intended or foreseen or even in any meaningful sense been aware of. That is, in its own way, one of the most mysterious things about the natural world. Not the things that defy explanation, but the things that explain themselves so completely and yet still manage, in their explanation, to remain astonishing. Final night thoughts.
the value of not knowing. As you lie here now, in whatever position your body has settled into, with the weight of the day behind you and the quiet of the night ahead, there is one last thought worth offering. Gently, without pressing it on you, just setting it down near you, where you can pick it up or not, as you choose.
The places we visited tonight, the deep Atlantic, the Wiltshire Plain, the Peruvian desert, the Pacific Island, the Turkmen Desert, the Nevada emptiness, the Romanian forest, the Arabian island, the African rock, the Laotian field, the Bay of Bengal island, the Namibian desert, the Venezuelan lake. They are all, in their different ways, places where human knowledge has run up against its own limits. Places where the question is bigger than the answer that's currently available. Places where the appropriate response to what you're seeing is not explanation, but attention, not conclusion, but wonder. We live in a world that places enormous value on knowing, on having answers, on being certain. And there are very good reasons for this. Certainty is useful. Knowledge is powerful. Understanding reduces suffering and enables achievement. But certainty, pursued too exclusively, can become its own kind of blindness. It can make us unwilling to sit with the questions that don't yet have answers, impatient with the mystery that hasn't yet resolved, dismissive of the strangeness that doesn't fit the categories we've already built. The world's most mysterious places are a reminder that the world is bigger than our current understanding of it, that the map is not the territory, that there are real places with real ground and real air and real light that our frameworks don't yet fully account for, and that encountering those places, either in person or like tonight in imagination, is not a failure of knowledge. It is an invitation to remain curious, to remain humble, to remain open to the possibility that the world still has things to show us that will require new ways of seeing.
That openness is a form of readiness, and readiness in a person who is genuinely rested, genuinely at ease, genuinely at peace with what they know and what they don't, is the soil in which all the good things grow. The discoveries, the connections, the moments of sudden, unexpected clarity that arrive not when you're straining toward them, but when you've let go enough for them to arrive. One more thought before sleep, on the courage of mystery. There is a particular kind of courage that belongs to the people who first stood at Stonehenge, or on the shore of Rapa Nui, or at the edge of the Catatumbo River watching the lightning. It is not the courage of battle or of physical hardship, though many of them knew those kinds of courage too. It is the courage of being small in a large and incomprehensible world, and choosing to build anyway, to carve anyway, to pray and plant and make art and erect monuments to things you cannot fully see or touch or name, and to do all of this not despite the mystery, but because of it. Because the mystery demands a response from the part of human nature that cannot simply sit still in the face of the unknown, that must reach toward it, must try to speak to it in whatever language is available.
The Nazca people, drawing their enormous figures on the desert floor for an eye they could never occupy, were practicing that courage. The Rapa Nui carvers, cutting their statues from the volcanic rock of a quarry on one of the most remote islands on Earth, were practicing it. The builders of Stonehenge, carrying those enormous blue stones 250 miles from Wales to Wiltshire over multiple generations, were practicing it in the most sustained and collective way imaginable, a commitment of entire lifetimes, of inherited labor, of trust that what they were building mattered, even if the full meaning of it would not be visible until after they were gone. That courage is not extinct. It lives in every scientist who studies a problem that may not yield answers in their lifetime, in every artist who makes work for an audience that doesn't yet exist, in every person who loves something larger than themselves and tends to it with care, not because they know how the story ends, but because the tending itself seems worth doing. The mysterious places of the world are monuments to that impulse, imperfect, incomplete, sometimes catastrophically costly in human terms, but real acts of reaching toward the unknown by people who were in all the ways that matter exactly like us. You carry that impulse too. It is what brought you here tonight, to this quiet place, to these slow stories about strange and beautiful corners of the world. The curiosity, the willingness to wonder, the ability to find rest not in certainty, but in the generous, spacious practice of not yet knowing. That is enough, more than enough. Carry it gently into sleep. Good night, wherever in the world you are. A gentle word on time and the ancient world.
Before we fully let the night take over, there is one small thing worth saying about all these places and all these mysteries, something that has been implicit throughout tonight's journey, but perhaps deserves to be said plainly in the quiet before sleep. Every single one of the places we visited tonight was made by, or shaped by, or is connected to human beings. Real people who woke up in the morning and ate breakfast and had concerns about the weather and felt tired in the afternoons. The builders of Stonehenge were not mythological figures. They were people with sore backs and calloused hands and probably strong opinions about the best way to move a sarsen stone, and disagreements with their neighbors, and moments of joy when the sun rose over the heelstone at exactly the right angle and they knew the alignment was correct. The Rapa Nui carvers in the Rano Raraku quarry were people who had learned their craft from older people, who taught it in turn to younger ones, who were proud of their work and probably worried about whether it was good enough. The Nazca people who cleared the desert floor of its pebbles, line by careful line, were people who believed deeply in what they were doing, who felt the weight of the community's need for rain in every hour of their labor.
We do not know their names. We do not know what they called themselves, or what songs they sang while they worked, or what they said to each other when the day's labor was done. The silence between us and them is very deep and very wide, and across that silence we can hear almost nothing. Just the work, just the stone and the lines and the fire and the circles and the jars and the lightning. Just the enormous, patient, improbable evidence that human beings were here before us, doing what human beings do, building things, making things, reaching toward things, and leaving that reaching behind them in the landscape for those of us who came later to find. We found it. We are still finding it. And there is something in that continuity, in that unbroken chain of human curiosity, stretching from the people who first drew the Nazca figures to the researchers who study them today, from the people who first stood at the edge of the door to hell to the tourists who camp beside it tonight, from the Rapa Nui who first carved a moai to the archaeologists who are still working to understand what the moai meant. There is something in that chain that is, in its own quiet way, one of the most comforting things in the world. We are not the first. We will not be the last. The mystery was here before us, and it will be here after us, patient and generous and inexhaustible. And tonight, in this small moment of rest, we are part of it too. Travelers who paused at the edge of the unknown long enough to breathe it in before moving on.
If tonight's journey helped carry you towards sleep, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Heyo, Boring History for Sleep. I am working towards my first 1,000 subscribers, and every single one matters enormously to this channel and to me. Leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. And if you have any sleepy hype left before the night takes you, please send it our way. Until next time, rest well. Sleep well. The world keeps its mysteries safely until morning.